Thank you, Miss Pam. What a song. I'm not sure I even need to preach after that. I'm still going to, but I'm not sure that we need to. We've got Jesus. We need nothing else, and so that's exciting. Hey, while we're getting situated here tonight, first, can I just say thank you to my teenagers? Hey, guys, man, I'm glad that you're here tonight. Appreciate you guys being here. I was talking to Anna earlier, and I was just asked her if she knew of anybody that was coming in tonight, and she asked me, she said, Dad, do you think there'll be a lot of teenagers here? And I said, well, yeah, I expect them to be here because they're good teenagers. And so they've got good parents who make them come, even when they don't want to come. And so it's good to see you guys here. I know you kind of sprinkled around the building here, and just good to see you here tonight. I'm excited for this opportunity. I want to thank the pastor even for the opportunity to be here tonight and to be able to speak and just to share a few things over the next several weeks, and just something God's just put on my heart to share with you guys. And I think a lot of people in life, we often question our meaning, like our existence. We question, why am I here? What is my purpose in life? What is it all about? Sometimes we make decisions in life. Maybe it's a huge decision that you've had to make, and you make that decision in life, and you just kind of question, like, did I make the right decision? Why did I even have to make this decision in the first place? And what was the purpose for it? Maybe it was, for our teenagers, it's a college choice. Like, where am I going to go to school? I'm about to graduate in a couple of years, and I need to make this choice, and I'm not really sure where I need to go and what I need to do. I don't even know what I want to do career-wise, and maybe that's the choice. Maybe it's a career choice, and maybe you're an adult and you're here and you're in one career, but maybe you got another opportunity and you're trying to figure out, do I need to make this change? Do I need to make this move? And you're not sure, and maybe when you make the decision at first, you're really not sure, did I make the right decision or not? And you're questioning, what is the meaning? What's the purpose behind all this? Maybe it's your marriage, and you're struggling with that and the decisions with it. Maybe it's some kind of parenting decision that you've had to make, and maybe it was a medical decision on treatment and how to walk through something, maybe for yourself or for a family member. Maybe it's some sort of financial investment. Whatever it is, we've got these decisions, right, that we constantly have to make in life, and oftentimes, if you're like me, and I hope I'm not the only one in here, but we make those decisions, and they say it's a step of faith, right? If we knew the outcome of the decisions we were going to make, there wouldn't be any faith involved, right? And they wouldn't say anything about that. But we take steps of faith because we're not sure what's going to be the outcome of it. We're not sure what's the meaning behind it. What's the purpose of having to make this decision? And so we struggle with these types of things, and we're just not really sure what it is. And really, I just believe, oftentimes we say, hey, let's conquer our fears and this and that. But I always just think that there is always going to be a touch of fear inside of our faith, because there's that uncertainty that's there. That did I make the right decision? It's hard to know, like, am I following God's will or am I just following the flesh? Is this something that God wants me to do, or is this just something that I really want to do, and so I've convinced myself that it's God's will? What is the meaning? What's the purpose behind all of this? There's a story told of this man. He had 4 sons, and so he wanted his sons to learn to not judge things too quickly, and so he decided that he was going to send each of them on this quest, each of them on this journey, and they were going to go to this far distant way just to look at a simple pear tree. And so he's going to send his sons on the way, but he sent the first one in the wintertime, he sent the second one in spring, the third in the summer, and then the fourth one he sent in the fall. And when they had all gone on their journeys and they come back, the dad sat them down and he said, hey, tell me what you saw. Tell me what you thought about the tree. And the first son who went in the winter, he said, man, I just saw an ugly tree, just bent, crooked, lifeless. There was nothing to it. The second son stepped in. He said, no, man. He said, I saw a tree. It was full of green buds, and it had all this promise in it, and a spectacular thing. And the third son said, no, man, that tree, it was full of blossoms. It smelled real pretty. It looked like it was just a beautiful thing. It was very graceful and just a very pretty tree. And the fourth son said, I disagree with you. He said, this tree, man, it was ripe. It was drooping with all of these big, pear fruit things on it. And it just looked phenomenal, full of life, full of fulfillment. Everything looked great with it. And so the man explained to his sons, he said, listen, all of you are right. All of you are right because you had each seen the tree in a different season of the tree's life. He told them that you can't judge a tree or you can't judge your life based on just one season of that tree or just one season of your life. The essence of who they are and the pleasure, the joy, and everything that you get out of your life can only be measured at the end of your life when everything is done. And if you give up when it's winter, you're going to miss the promise of your spring, the beauty of your summer, and the fulfillment of your fall. So the whole moral and the purpose of the story is simply this. Let's not judge life based on one difficult season. Don't let the pain of one season destroy the joy of all the rest. I believe that the journey, the story of Moses in the Bible is one such story. It's one that if we were to look at just one season of Moses' life, we might be quick to judge and think, man, what a wasted life, what a mistake, what a mess that is. But then when we look at the end of Moses' life and we put everything back together through all of the seasons of Moses' life, we see one that was full of meaning, a life that was full of purpose and had a lot of potential inside of it. But Moses, and if you know his story a little bit, he was asked to walk by faith a lot, and I'm sure on a number of occasions he probably questioned his decisions, like, why in the world did I get messed up with these people, right? I should have just stayed where I was at. But God used him, and you look at his life, and we see meaning, and we see purpose. And so what we're going to do over the next several weeks is we're going to kind of walk through the book of Exodus and study Moses' life. And we're going to look at the different areas of it and see what we can pull out of it so that maybe through Moses' life and looking at Moses' journey, maybe we can find some meaning for our own lives. Maybe we can find a purpose in our life, whether we're a teenager in the room here tonight and we've got a whole bunch of life in front of us that we think, and maybe you're kind of midlife and middle age here and you're just kind of going through life. Maybe it just seems stagnant and you're just trying to think, am I doing the right thing? Is this working for me? Or maybe you're at the end of your life and you're thinking, man, am I done? Is my meaning over? And as we walk through Moses' life, I'm hoping that for every age in this room that we'll be able to find some kind of meaning and purpose with our lives. I love what the Life Application Bible says about Moses. Listen to what he says here. He says this. It says, in Moses, we see an outstanding personality shaped by God. But we must not misunderstand what God did. He did not change who or what Moses was. He did not give Moses new abilities and strengths. Instead, he took Moses' characteristics and molded them until they were suited to his purposes. You see, does knowing this make a difference in your understanding of God's purpose in your life? He is trying to take what he created in the first place and use it for its intended purposes. The next time you talk with God, don't ask God, what should I change into? But the question should be, how should I use my own abilities and strengths to do your will? The story of Moses starts and it takes off in the book of Exodus, and so we're going to kind of walk through the book of Exodus here a little bit, and here in just a minute I'm going to give you some details and things on the book of Exodus here. But Moses, when he wrote the Exodus, second book of the Bible, I think most of us know that. And this book, it falls into a category of what we call the Pentateuch, right? It's the first 5 books of the Old Testament, first 5 books of the Bible. These are all books written by Moses himself. And so I can only imagine, if you know the story of Moses, and maybe a spoiler alert if you don't know Moses that well, but Moses, he kills a guy, okay? I can only imagine as he's writing this, and he's being moved by the Holy Spirit, right, to write these words, and God's like, hey, put this part in here. And Moses, oh, wait a minute, God. I can't tell somebody I killed people. I can't do that, But why? Because there's a purpose in it. There's a meaning in every aspect of Moses' life, even in the winter months, if you will, where his life looked dead, it looked lifeless. There was a meaning and a purpose behind it. And so Moses, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, he's writing these words. He writes the book of Exodus for us. And here's what happens. You jump into the New Testament of the Bible, and Moses is mentioned quite a bit in the New Testament. But one of the good things, I guess, about Moses, we find him in what we call the hall of faith of the Bible, right? Hebrews chapter number 11. And Moses' life is summed up in here in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 24 and verse 25. It says, by faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. Again, notice the wording there, for a season. We cannot take our lives and just focus on one season of it. There's so much more to life than just one season. And Moses, he could have enjoyed his life. He could have enjoyed the happenstance and the situation that put him into the king's palace and the Pharaoh's palace. He could have enjoyed all of that and just stayed in that comfort zone there. But God had a bigger meaning. God had a bigger purpose for his life. And he needed to see it unfold. And so here, as we jump in tonight, let's first look at some miscellaneous details real quick. I was taught in Bible college that a text without its context is nothing more than a pretext. And basically this idea that we cannot stand up and preach and just pull any scripture out of this and just preach it how we want to preach it. There's a context. There's a reason why that verse is there. And I believe the books of the Bible are the same way. And so to understand really the book of Exodus, to understand Moses' life, we really need to understand the context of it all. And the events of Exodus actually begin for us in the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible. Genesis is a really cool book. I really love Genesis. I honestly thought about maybe us walking through that, but the pastor talked about one day he'd like to do a study through the life of Joseph, and the book of Genesis covers a lot about the life of Joseph, and so I didn't want to step on any of that, and so Exodus was next. And no, that's not how I got there, but Genesis is a very cool book. It starts out right. It starts out in the very beginning. We find out where everything came from. In the beginning, God created, right? And through the first two chapters, really, of Genesis, we see where God creates everything. He creates the sun, the moon, the stars, the planets, the universe, all of these things, the plants, the grass, the birds of the air, and the fish in the sea, and all the land animals, the lions, tigers, and bears. Thank you. I knew it was coming. He created all of this stuff, right? And we read this, and man, we are absolutely fascinated with creation, are we not? We're perplexed about the universe and what's out there, And I follow NASA on Snapchat, and it's just really cool. And they talk about a whole lot of smart things. Honestly, I don't understand half the stuff they talk about, but they do some really cool things. And just this last week, they launched this probe. You guys hear about this? They launched this probe to touch the sun. It's going to be the closest anything's ever gotten to the core of the sun, and they're sending this thing into the sun. Why? Because they're fascinated by it. We're fascinated by this universe. We're fascinated on how we got here and where we came from and what is all this about? Is there life in other planets? And we're fascinated by all of this creation. But do you understand, have you ever noticed that God just spends 2 chapters of the Bible telling us how all that got here? In the entire rest of the book of Genesis, there's 50 chapters in the book of Genesis, 2 of them dedicated to creation, and the other 48 of those chapters are dedicated and focused to God's relationship with his grandest creation, that of mankind. And so Genesis, it dives into all of this, and so we begin to see God's relationship with people, and we see it there, in Genesis chapter 2 through chapter number 5, we see the story of Adam. And we see God's creation of Adam. God creates Eve and all those types of things. And then Genesis chapter 6 to 11, we see the story of Noah. And then we see the story of Abraham in Genesis chapter 12 through chapter 25. We see the story of Isaac in Genesis 25 to chapter 28. The story of Jacob in Genesis 28 to 36. And then we see the story of Joseph in Genesis chapter 37 through the end of the book, chapter 50. And so God spends all this time focusing on his relationship with his grandest creation of mankind. And if we can, just to kind of summarize all this and trying to keep a long story somewhat short tonight, what essentially happens and what leads us to the book of Exodus and what eventually leads us to the life of Moses is that during this time with Joseph in his life, this severe famine happens. And so Jacob and his family, they go to Egypt to live with Joseph, who, through a series of events that Pastor will cover sometime in the future, through a series of events, Joseph was promoted to second in power behind the Pharaoh. And again, God's using all of this to set up this nation of Israel and to just pull us through the book of Exodus. And so what happens is this family, Jacob and his family, what we know as the nation of Israel, they moved to Egypt so that Joseph can take care of them because of this famine and all of these types of situations that's taking place there. And while Joseph and the Pharaoh were alive, the family of Jacob and them, they were all treated very well. They were treated good. They were taken care of. But after a couple hundred years, the death of Joseph, the death of the pharaohs, and change of power and these types of things, what happens is a new Pharaoh takes charge. And this new Pharaoh doesn't know Joseph. He doesn't know the history and all this types of things. But he knows there's this huge delegation of foreigners, if you will, in their country. In the country of Egypt. And so he gets a little scared about this. He gets a little threatened by all of these Hebrews in their country. And so his idea was, I'm just going to make them slaves. And this is what we read in Exodus chapter 1 there, beginning verse number 7. It says, but the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph, and he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Verse 11 says, therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. You see, this Pharaoh, he was afraid that the Hebrews were going to outnumber the Egyptians, and he felt, man, if some country comes to attack us, that these Hebrews, they might join the enemy forces and they'll overtake us. And so basically, he just kind of jumped before they jumped. And so he throws them into slavery, and he forces them, makes them their slaves. And right there, I begin to question, like, why does this happen? I mean, again, if you study the book of Genesis and you study all of this, when you get to the life of Abraham, God makes this covenant with Abraham, right? That he's going to make this great nation out of Abraham. And that, I mean, so many, just like you can't count the stars, you wouldn't be able to count the descendants of Abraham. And it was just going to be this great nation and all of this. And so then I'm like, wait, if God was going to do that, why in the world did he put them in this slavery? Why did he send them to Egypt? Why did all this stuff have to take place and transpire and them end up in the slavery? Just doesn't really make sense. I begin to think about it. 4 reasons, I think, for Israel's bondage. Number 1 has to do with dependence. I think the reason for Israel's bondage is because it would bring them to the end of themselves, so that they were forced to depend themselves on God and not on themselves. It would force them to cry out to God to deliver them out of this bondage. And if you think about it, doesn't God often do that in our own lives? Doesn't God often sometimes bring us to the end of ourselves and allows people to experience how terrible sin can be in order for what? To make us dependent upon God. The other reason I think that God does this is to despise. I think God did this to reveal the despicable nature of Egypt, which when you read about Egypt in the Bible and in the Old Testament, you can usually use Egypt as a picture of the world. And I think this reveals the despicable nature of Egypt, or the despicable nature of the world in the way that we apply the scriptures here. And man, the world looked good, didn't it? Egypt looked good. It was cultured, it was sophisticated, it was charming, it was powerful. They had what they seemed to have. But yet, and through all of its allure, Egypt was a very wicked place led by a very hard taskmaster with unbending demands on its slaves. And if that doesn't apply to our lives and the way that Satan works. Thirdly, I think it's to show that Egypt deserved punishment. Again, picturing the world that we deserve punishment. You see, the Pharaoh was heartless and he was ruthless, and so when the punishment came, the people knew that was deserved. They knew that was the end of it. And for us, as we live in this world today and we see all the wickedness and all the terrible things going on, we have to understand this is what the world deserves. Because of sin, because of wickedness, the world deserves this kind of judgment. It's to be there. Why? The 4th reason is to display God's power. You see, I believe that God put Israel in bondage, and sometimes I think God does the same thing in our own lives to display his power in our lives, to see that what God could do in and through his people when they truly depend upon him. And I believe that God sees that, or I believe that the world sees that in Christians, and they see God's power displayed in our lives. And so I believe those are reasons for Israel's bondage. Now, jumping back into the book of Exodus here, let me share with you briefly here tonight. Let me share with you an overview of the book of Exodus. Again, we're kind of getting all the facts and all the groundwork laid tonight. Overview of the book of Exodus real quick. Number 1, I think God hears. In Exodus chapter 1 to Exodus chapter 6, I believe the overwhelming theme is that God hears Israel's cries. He hears their cries for help. And again, if you know the story, you know they're in bondage here when we open up the book of Israel, book of Exodus, the people of Israel in bondage, and they're crying out for God to help them. They got this ruthless taskmaster over top of them. And so God is going to use this guy named Moses to deliver his people out of here. And so God hears their cries. Number 2 is that God saves. God saves. In Exodus chapter 7 through chapter 18, we see where Moses goes in with the help of his brother Aaron, and he goes in, hey, let my people go to the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh says no, and then all those 10 plagues come, and it gets really bad, and so eventually all the firstborn are killed, and so the Pharaoh says, okay, go, and so the Israelites, they run, and then Pharaoh changes his mind, and so then he comes chasing after them, and they get stuck there at the Red Sea, and then they're like, what are we going to do? And what did God do? He saved the people of Israel by parting the Red Sea. The people walk across the dry ground. Pharaoh's armies try to follow them. The waters cave in and drowns them all and kills them. God saves Israel. Part number 3 is that God promises. In Exodus chapter 19 through chapter 34, we see that God makes this covenant with Israel, and God begins to work there as they're working their way through the wilderness there, and God meets with Moses in Mount Sinai, and God makes this covenant with the nation of Israel and the generations that are going to come, because he rescued them from from Egypt. Israel is now to observe his rules, and so God gives the 10 commandments, and they're to follow these ordinances there. In these chapters as well, we see things don't quite go as planned, and we're going to see that while Moses is getting the 10 Commandments, the Israelites are down worshiping a golden calf, and that doesn't end up very well. But God makes this promise with Israel. Then number 4, I think we see God dwells. In Exodus chapter 35 to verse 40, God dwells with Israel, and he doesn't stop there with just a list of rules for his people, but he gives Moses instructions to build a tabernacle, this special tent of worship, and God was going to dwell. And the book of Exodus ends here in this glorious moment where the glory of the Lord is filling the tabernacle, and God is dwelling amongst his people. God dwells with us today. I think it's important to note, as we continue laying these miscellaneous details, I think it's important for us to note that in Egypt, God never gave his law to Israel. You see, God had to save them first, and then they were to obey. I believe Exodus has a lot of spiritual applications for us and for salvation and Christian life and all these types of things. We'll dive into some of those over the next several weeks, and that I'm really excited to get into here. But these experiences that Israel has had as a nation, they're just examples that all of us as Christians, we go through as well. I believe the Pharaoh can be a picture or illustration, maybe use the word type, of Satan. Pharaoh was a very hard taskmaster. He gave no rest. He gave no joy. He gave no contentment to the people. And people who are charmed by Satan eventually find themselves to be under the burden of a hard and a cruel taskmaster. Exodus shows Christians how to avoid the bondage of sin by winning personal battles in our own lives. And so it's a really beautiful book. It's one that hopefully will be an exciting thing for us to walk through, an exciting thing to see, especially as we follow through the life of Moses and try to figure out Moses' meaning through all of this and these types of things. But Paul, in the New Testament, Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians, his first letter, and in 1 Corinthians chapter number 10, Paul, he mentions Israel. He mentions the nation of Israel and their time back that we're going to be studying here in Israel. And this is what he ends up saying in verse number 11. He says, "Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction on who the end of the ages has come." So as we study this, and as we walk through the life of Moses, and we see these things, and we see the nation of Israel and everything that they're going through, we need to understand that we have all of these things written down for our instruction. People say, well, the Old Testament, that's old, and we don't need it anymore. No, God gave us this for our example, for our instruction, for us to learn from these types of things. And when it comes to Moses, I think, we're going to find a lot of meaning in Moses' life. You think about Moses, in his life, and if you know his story a little bit, he was miraculously saved in a time when he should have been killed. We'll see that here in just a minute. But Moses, he ends up being raised in the Pharaoh's house and all of these types of things. And I can't help but wonder if Moses didn't have a little bit of a chip on his shoulder, and you kind of see that sometimes. And Pastor and I was talking I don't know, this week or last week, we were talking about Moses and his life, and sometimes he just kind of had this attitude, you know. Anger was kind of a weakness of his. It was kind of one of his struggles. So it was that sometimes he just lost his temper, and that was one of those things. Remember when he struck the rock, and he was supposed to speak to it, but he hit the rock, and that cost him entrance into the promised land eventually. But anger was something, and I can't help but think that maybe that's because of his upbringing. I mean, maybe he had this chip on his shoulder because of his past, and he's just trying to figure out life for himself, and what is the meaning in my life? And so here we dive in tonight, and let's jump in here quickly tonight. And number 2, I just want you to see tonight the midwife's dedication. The midwife's dedication here, as we learned earlier, the Pharaoh, he was very intimidated by the Hebrews, right? They were growing numerically, and all these things were happening for them that he decided he was going to take them captive. He's going to force them to be as slaves. But Exodus chapter 1 and verse number 12, it actually tells us that this plan didn't work out very well for the Pharaoh. Look what happened here in verse number 12. It says, "But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel." So this guy is like, man, I'm going to put them in slavery. That's going to take care of them, right? That's going to do the job. But what happened was that the harder they afflicted them, man, the more they were having kids. It was stress relief, I guess. But the more they oppressed them, the more they multiplied, and the more that they spread abroad. And so because that plan didn't work, the Pharaoh had to come up with another plan. So here's what he did. He then orders the Hebrew midwives. Hey, Tina, do you guys know what midwives is? Anybody know over there? Midwife? Anybody? Robbie knows? I'm glad you're associating yourself with a teenager, Robbie. I appreciate that. A midwife was basically like a baby doctor, right? And so they would come in, they would help with the deliveries of these things. And so this is what the Pharaoh did with these midwives, these Hebrew midwives, these baby doctors. He told them, he said, listen, if a Hebrew woman comes in and she's going to have a child, they said, if it's a son, just kill it. If it's a girl, it's okay, but if it's a son, kill it. Look what it says there, Exodus chapter 1, verse 15 and 16. It says, "Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, and the other Puah, when you serve as a midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him, but if it is a daughter, she shall live." But that problem didn't work either. Look what happens here. Exodus chapter 1, verse 17 down to verse 21. It says, "But the midwives feared God, and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives, and he said to them, 'Why have you done this? And why have you let the male children live?' And the midwives said to the Pharaoh, 'Because these Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous, and they give birth before the midwives even come to them.' So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families." I found this interesting. I was studying and reading through the ESV Study Bible, and this is a thought they brought to my attention through this. It says this. It mentions in there, if you notice, it mentioned twice about these women, how they feared God, right? That they had this respect for God and for his being, if you will. And they feared God. They had respect for God. It also mentions the names of two of these midwives, right? Shiphrah and Puah. Mentions two of their names. Their names add nothing to the story. It doesn't do us any benefit to know those two ladies. We don't know anything else about them. We don't know anything about their background or what they did in the future. We know nothing about it. Their names add nothing to the story itself. But if you think about it, the name of the Pharaoh never mentioned. His name's not mentioned at all. And he's kind of a big player in all of this, right? And I think what happened here is I think that God shares the name of these two women because of their faithfulness to him in the midst of horrific situations. I mean, they're being ordered to kill their own people, basically. To kill these babies as soon as they're born. But they said, no, we're not going to do that. You understand, they're putting their own lives at risk to save the lives of these baby boys. These horrific situations. After all these years of oppression and after all these years of being put in a situation that could have cost them their own lives, they never lost their faith in God's provision and protection. So, after this attempt fails, the Pharaoh, he's got to go another step further. So here's what he does. He now commands that anybody who sees a Hebrew baby boy, anybody, not just these midwives, anybody who sees a Hebrew baby boy, they're to pick the boy up, take him to the Nile River, and throw him in it to drown. That was the command. That's atrocious, is it not? It's unbelievable to me that people could follow such a crazy command, that they would follow such a crazy leader. But then I think to myself, hey, have we not seen it time and time again, not just in Scripture, but in our own modern world as well? That we follow these crazy commands, and despite of these horrific situations, God is still working a plan. Let me give you one last thought tonight. We'll wrap things up. You see, the Pharaoh, if you notice there, he commanded all the boys to be killed, but he allowed the daughters to live. I begin to ask myself, why that? Why would he let the daughters live? Why would he let the girls live there? Why not just kill all of them? If you're that scared of them, if you're that intimidated by the Hebrews and them growing, why not just wipe them all out? But I think this is what happened. I think the Pharaoh underestimated the women. Right? He underestimated the women. He feared that the boys would grow up and that they would join some kind of army and that they would fight against Egypt and they would overtake Egypt themselves. But he never thought the women would do anything. He didn't expect anything of them. However, if you think about it, it was two Hebrew women, Shiphrah and Puah, who stood up and determined not to obey God, they decided to obey God, not man. And then as we walk through the story here and we continue Moses' story in the next weeks, we're going to see that it was Moses' mom and sister who defied the Pharaoh. They placed him in a basket, put him in the Nile River, flowed down the river. And then what happened? It was the Pharaoh's own daughter who found baby Moses and said, "Oh, Dad, I want to keep this one." And so here the Pharaoh lets him. And she raises this Hebrew baby. Crazy event stories we'll talk about in a few weeks, but through all of this, here's the thought. Just because the world may have counted you out, it doesn't mean that God can't use you. Through all of this, and again, we haven't really even begun to touch the tip of the iceberg of Moses' story, but through all of these things, we just see that the very first thing to understanding your meaning through Moses' life is simply this. Be determined to be dedicated to God. You never know what duty he might direct you to do. You just don't know where God's going to take your story. Your life right now might not seem like it's making any sense. It might not seem like there's a reason for it, but God has a purpose for your life. God has a purpose for the things that you're going through. In Sunday school this morning, we talked to our teenagers, and we were talking about Paul and his conversion back in the book of Acts. But I shared a little bit about my story and my personal testimony with the teenagers that, and how I got here, if you will, and what I do. And just briefly, just real quick, it's just this idea. My grandfather was a pastor. I grew up in church all the time, and my grandfather was a pastor. I was in church, active in our youth department and things, and one summer, our church, they were going to take a mission trip to Mexico, and for whatever reason, I wasn't interested in going on the trip, and so I had no plans to go, and so I didn't sign up to go, wasn't going to go, but then just a few weeks before the trip was to take place, my grandfather calls me, and he said, "Hey, there's a guy on the trip, he's not able to go anymore, got himself in some trouble, he's not allowed to go on a trip." He said, "I really want you to go." He said, "I really believe," he said, there's a $100 balance left on this trip. He said, if you'll commit to go, I'll pay that $100. I just want you to go. Well, it's my grandpa. I can't say no to him, right? And so I decided to go to this trip down to Mexico. Didn't think anything of it. It's a mission trip, but I was just like, 2 weeks in another country. That sounds cool. And so we took these 2 weeks. I told our teenagers, I don't remember a whole lot about the trip, honestly. A few things stick out in my mind, but not a whole lot of it. But we get done, we come back from the trip, and then we did, just like we do here for camp, we had like a night service where we just focused on that. We talked and gave testimonies and things. And so I got up, I was ready to share my testimony about how much fun I had on this mission trip and the cool things I saw and stuff like that. And I was up, standing behind a pulpit much like this and talking to our church. And all of a sudden, I just began to cry from the pulpit. And before I could even stop the words from coming out of my mouth, I said, "This is what God wants to do with my life." I couldn't stop it. I had no plan to say that, no expectation to surrender to the ministry at that time, but God was working. And through all the crazy circumstances and me not signing up for this trip, and God said, no, you're going. And so God made a way to get me on that trip because God had a plan, God had a meaning and a purpose behind that for me. I didn't understand it. I didn't know what it was. But he had a plan. He had a purpose. I also told our teenagers that from the time I was in 7th grade to the time I graduated out of our youth ministry that we had somewhere around 6 different youth pastors that came in and out. And it just devastated me to get to know these guys and, just fall in love with them and their ministries and who they are and their families. And then, 12, 18 months, they were on the road and heading somewhere else. It just crushed me. But again, God was working a plan. He was working something in me because what that did was that gave me a passion for teenagers. And so I began to pray, God, I just want you to put me in a ministry and lead me. I don't want to bounce around. I don't want to be in 15 different ministries or anything like that. I said, God, just put me somewhere and just lead me. And now here I'm 15 years in the ministry, and I've been in 2 ministries. Served 9.5 years in the first ministry and coming up on 6 years here. God's working a plan in your life. It doesn't always make sense. Sometimes it's painful, but there's a meaning behind it. Just be determined to be dedicated to God. If you do that, God will show you in his time. He'll show you the purpose behind it. Will you bow your heads? Tonight, we're just going to have a little moment of reflection, if you will, and Nick will come and play on the piano. I truly believe there's meaning for everybody's life. I don't think that God makes any mistakes. There's a purpose in your life. There's a reason why you're here. Whether you're in this room and you're 12 years old and you're in 7th grade and just trying to figure out who you are, or maybe you're 7 years old and you're retired, you're tired in life, and you're trying to think, why am I still here? I want you to understand that there's a meaning behind your existence. And if you just simply submit yourself to God and not just focus on one season of your life, that God will direct you what to do. He'll show you what that purpose is that he has for you. So my challenge to you and my encouragement to you tonight is that you just simply begin to ask God, God, what do you want from me? I don't want to just look at one season of my life and count myself out for your honor and for your glory. I want to be useful for you. And so maybe tonight, maybe as we have this little time of reflection, maybe you need to just come down here and say, God, I don't know where I'm at, I don't know what I'm doing, but God, I need you to show me. God, help me not to focus on this one season, but help me to know that you've got a purpose. You've got a plan for everything I'm going through. I'm going to pray, and after I pray, I'll ask you to stand to your feet, and we'll just take a few minutes tonight. God, we love you. God, we thank you for your goodness in our lives. God, life is hard. Life's difficult. Life doesn't always make sense to us. But God, there's a meaning behind it. There's a reason why we're here. And God, I pray that you would just show each and every individual in this room what their meaning is, what the purpose is in this life. God, I pray that you would encourage us through the life of Moses to know that you've got a plan for us. God, we give you all the honor and the glory for it. In your name we do pray. Amen. Would you stand to your feet tonight?